Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we trace the secret pathways carved through Maryland's midnight forests, safe houses, coated quilts, and whispered names that moved hundreds of people from bondage into freedom, all hidden in plain sight. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your body settle into whatever surface holds you now. Feel the weight of your shoulders, your hips, your heels, all of it releasing downward, gently, without effort. Tonight, we are going somewhere very specific. A particular kind of darkness. The darkness of the eastern shore of Maryland, in the middle of the 19th century, before the Civil War changed everything. A darkness made of pine forests and tidal rivers and flat marshlands stretching toward the Chesapeake Bay. It was a darkness that some people feared. And a darkness that at least one woman learned to love, because it kept her alive. You don't need to do anything right now. Just breathe. Let the story come to you slowly, like water rising through still ground. Part 1: A Woman Made of Silence. There is an image that has stayed with historians for over a century and a half, and it begins not with a dramatic escape or a nighttime chase, but with something far quieter. A small girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, standing at the edge of a field in Dorchester County, Maryland, watching the mist come off the water. The Blackwater River is nearby. You can smell it, the low, green smell of brackish marsh, of decomposing reeds, of mud that has absorbed 1,000 seasons of rain. The air in the early morning on the eastern shore has a particular quality that those who grew up there never quite forget. It is heavy. It is damp. It settles on the skin like a cool cloth. The girl's name, at that moment in time, was Araminta Ross. She would later change it to Harriet Tubman. And the silence she was standing in the silence of that marsh, that flat land, that wide sky, was something she was already learning to read. Because silence, in the world she was born into, was never simply silence. It was information. The absence of a dog's bark meant safety. The stillness of the water meant no one was crossing it. The particular hush of a forest at 3 in the morning meant you could move. Let's begin at the beginning. Not with heroism, but with a life. A quiet, specific, painful, and extraordinary life. Araminta Ross was born around 1822, though the exact year remains uncertain. She would not have known her own birthday with precision, because enslaved people in antebellum America were rarely given that small gift of self-knowledge. She was one of 9 children born to Harriet Green and Benjamin Ross, both enslaved on plantations owned by Edward Brodess, in Dorchester County, Maryland. Dorchester County sits in the heart of Maryland's eastern shore, a peninsula bounded by the Chesapeake Bay on the west and the Delaware border on the north and east. It is one of the flattest places in America. The land barely rises above sea level. Creeks and rivers cut through it in every direction, the Choptank, the Blackwater, the Little Blackwater, and in between these waterways lie vast marshes and dense stands of loblolly pine and sweet gum and red maple. It was, in the 19th century, a deeply rural world. Small farms, some larger plantations, scattered villages, country roads that turned to mud in the winter rains. Cambridge was the county seat, a modest town on the south bank of the Choptank River. From Cambridge, you could look north across the wide water toward the upper reaches of the bay. And somewhere out beyond the bay, somewhere to the north that a young Araminta Ross could not see or visit or fully imagine, was freedom. But before we follow her north, we must understand what she was surviving in the south. What life on the eastern shore actually looked like, smelled like, felt like, for a person who was enslaved. The Brodes farm was not a grand plantation in the manner of the Deep South. It was a modest operation, a working farm, and the people who lived there in bondage were hired out regularly to neighboring families and farms. This was common in Maryland. Enslaved people were treated as economic assets, rented to whoever needed labor, separated from their families for weeks or months at a time, moved around the county according to the needs and finances of their enslavers. For Araminta, this meant that from a very young age, she was sent to work in other people's homes. She was hired out as an infant, essentially, to work as a domestic servant. She trapped muskrats in the cold water of tidal creeks, her small hands numb with cold. She was sent to work for a woman named Miss Susan, who beat her when she didn't dust the furniture quickly enough, who required her to stay awake through the night rocking a baby, who punished her at dawn when the baby cried. She ran away from Miss Susan's house once, back to her mother. She hid in a pig pen for 5 days, sharing scraps with the pigs to survive. She was returned and beaten again. Let that settle for a moment. She was perhaps 7 years old. And she had already learned that running, even when necessary, was complicated. That every escape required planning, required a hiding place, required knowledge of who might help and who might betray you. These early lessons, bought at enormous personal cost, would eventually become the foundation of the most remarkable freedom network in American history. But something else happened to Araminta Ross before any of that. Something that would mark her body and her mind for the rest of her life. When she was perhaps 13 years old, she was working at a dry goods store in a nearby village when an overseer tried to restrain another enslaved man who had left the fields without permission. The overseer ordered Araminta to help him restrain the man. She refused. The man ran. And the overseer grabbed a 2-pound lead weight from the counter and threw it, not at the fleeing man, but wildly, imprecisely, and it struck Araminta squarely in the head. She was carried home, bleeding. She lay unconscious for days. Her owner offered her for sale during this time, while she was still unable to sit up, unable to speak. No one would buy her. She survived. But the injury changed her. For the rest of her life, through every mission she ran, every forest she crossed, every river she waded, she would experience sudden, uncontrollable episodes of unconsciousness. She would simply fall asleep, without warning, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes mid-step. She would be gone for a minute, or 2, or 5, and then she would return, as if nothing had happened. This was almost certainly temporal lobe epilepsy, caused by the traumatic brain injury. And it is one of the most remarkable and haunting facts about Harriet Tubman's story that the woman who led dozens of people through the most dangerous landscape in antebellum America did so while carrying this condition inside her, this unpredictable darkness that could come at any moment. Whether you understand those visions through the lens of neurology or through the lens of faith, and Tubman herself would have said there was no difference, the effect on her life was profound. She trusted them completely. She acted on them without hesitation. And in the years ahead, that trust would save her own life and the lives of many, many others. She was still Araminta Ross when all of this happened. She would not become Harriet Tubman for several more years. But the person who would become Harriet Tubman was already forming, in the darkness and pain of the Eastern Shore, learning lessons that no school could have taught her. Part 2, The the land she knew before she left it. There is something important to understand about the geography of the Eastern Shore before we follow Harriet Tubman's first steps northward. Something that might not be obvious when you look at a modern map. The Eastern Shore of Maryland in the 1840s was not simply a rural landscape. It was a landscape of extraordinary complexity, threaded through with obstacles and aids in almost equal measure. Understanding it, its creeks, its roads, its farms, its people, was not a luxury. It was survival. And Harriet Tubman knew it with the deep, embodied knowledge of someone who had spent her entire life there. Consider the waterways. The Choptank River, which flows roughly east to west across the middle of Dorchester County before emptying into the Chesapeake Bay, is not a small stream you can step across. It is a wide, slow, serious river. Its banks are marshy and treacherous in many places. In winter, it runs cold and gray and fast. Crossing it at the wrong place could mean drowning. Crossing it at the right place, a shallow ford, a hidden footbridge, a spot where a sympathetic ferryman might look the other way, could mean the difference between capture and freedom. North of the Choptank, the land becomes slightly higher, slightly drier. The forest thickens. The roads are fewer. There are farms scattered among the trees, and some of those farms belong to Quakers, members of the Society of Friends, who had been committed to opposing slavery since the 18th century. These farms were, in some cases, places where a person moving north in the darkness might find a meal, a hiding place, a set of dry clothes. But you had to know which farms. You had to know which doors to knock on. And you had to knock at exactly the right time, in exactly the right way, so that the person who opened the door understood what you were asking and felt safe enough to offer it. This was the essential logic of what we now call the Underground Railroad, though the term was not widely used until the 1840s, and was never used by the people who were actually using it, who were understandably reluctant to call attention to what they were doing. The Underground Railroad was not a single, unified organization. It was not a centrally managed network with formal membership, official routes, and scheduled departures. It was something far more organic, far more fragile, and in many ways far more impressive than that. It was a loose constellation of people: free black Americans, white abolitionists, Quaker farmers, urban ministers, sympathetic innkeepers, and many others who occupied the vast gray zone between active support and quiet tolerance, who were willing to help enslaved people move toward freedom. They communicated through letters that said nothing dangerous, through trusted intermediaries, through coded messages and known symbols, and a set of shared understandings that were never written down because writing them down would have been fatal. On the Eastern Shore, the network was particularly decentralized. The region was deeply surveilled. Enslavers were acutely aware of the proximity of the Mason-Dixon line, which runs along the southern border of Pennsylvania, only about 70 miles from Cambridge, and they watched the northward roads with considerable anxiety. Slave patrols were common. Advertisements for runaways appeared frequently in the newspapers. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, strengthened dramatically in 1850, required even free states to return enslaved people who had escaped. Into this landscape, Harriet Tubman had grown up. She had absorbed it through years of outdoor labor, cutting timber with her father, Ben Ross, who was one of the most skilled woodsmen on the shore, and who sometimes hired her out to work alongside him. Ben Ross was a free man, or would eventually become one, though his wife remained enslaved, and their children along with her. Working with her father in the timber operations, Araminta learned the forest in a way that very few people of any background learned it. She learned to navigate by the North Star, the guiding light that appeared in the gap between the trees after the canopy closed in above the roads. She learned the feel of north, the slightly cooler air that came from that direction in the evening, the way the moss grew thicker on the north side of certain trees. She learned which streams ran north and which ones ran east toward the bay. She learned the smell of a hunting dog at a distance. She learned to cross water to break a scent trail, wading through cold creeks, moving along the rocky beds so that she left no footprints in the mud of the banks. She also learned people. She learned, with a careful and patient attention, which white men were dangerous and which were merely indifferent, which free black families on the shore kept their doors open to those in need, which churches offered genuine sanctuary and which merely offered the appearance of it. This social knowledge, intimate, nuanced, and dangerous to possess, was arguably as important as her knowledge of the terrain. In 1844, Araminta Ross married a free black man named John Tubman. It was an unusual marriage. She was still legally enslaved, he was free, and it was not without its complications. John Tubman did not share his wife's growing urgency about freedom. He was settled, cautious, perhaps afraid of the consequences of the kind of action she was beginning to contemplate. When she talked about running north, he threatened to tell her enslave her. She changed her name after the marriage, as was custom. She became Harriet, her mother's name. And in taking her mother's name, she was perhaps already beginning to see herself differently, not as the small, frightened child who had hidden in the pig pen, but as something larger. Someone capable of carrying other people through darkness. In 1849, Edward Brodess died. His death set off a chain of events that Harriet had feared and anticipated. Enslaved people were to be sold. She heard whispers that she and her brothers might be sent south to the deep south, to the cotton and sugar fields, to a world from which return was essentially impossible. The fear of being sold south was, for enslaved people on the upper south like the eastern shore, a particular and specific terror. Maryland was harsh, but it was not Mississippi. The brutality of the Deep South's plantation system was well known, carried north in whispers and stories by the few who had made it back. Going south meant going beyond reach. It meant losing any slim thread of connection to family, to the land you knew, to the narrow possibilities that existed even within bondage. And so the decision crystallized. She would go. She would go north. She would go into the darkness that she already knew, and she would find the other side of it. Part 3, The First Departure. There is a quality to the night on the eastern shore that is unlike night in most places. Far from any city, with no electricity and only occasional lantern light from farmhouse windows, the darkness was absolute and complete. The stars were extraordinary, the Milky Way visible as a thick river of light overhead, the North Star burning with particular steadiness above the tree line in the northern sky. It was into this darkness that Harriet Tubman walked, sometime in September of 1849. She was somewhere between 25 and 27 years old. She had never been more than a few dozen miles from the plantation where she was born. She had no money. She had no official papers proving she was free, because she was not free, not yet. She had knowledge. She had faith. She had her body, which had been broken and healed and broken again, and which knew how to keep moving. She had also, before she left, received a piece of information that would prove essential. A white woman, a Quaker woman whose name has been lost to history, or perhaps was deliberately never recorded, had quietly indicated to Harriet that if she ever needed help, she should go to a particular house and say a particular thing, and she would find shelter there. This was how the Underground Railroad operated. Not through grand declarations, but through a whispered name, a specific address, a gesture that could be denied if questioned. Each piece of information was a single link in a chain that none of its participants could see from end to end. Harriet's brothers, 3 of them had initially planned to come with her, turned back. Fear overtook them before they had gone very far. It was a pattern she would encounter again and again in the years ahead, people who desperately wanted freedom but could not, in the final moment, push through the terror of the attempt. She understood it. She had felt that terror herself. But she did not turn back with them. She continued north alone. The route she took in 1849 has been painstakingly reconstructed by historians, though its exact details remain partly uncertain because she herself was deliberately vague about it even decades later. Even in interviews given after the Civil War, she was careful not to compromise the people and places that had helped her, or to give information that might endanger those who came after her. What we know is this: she moved north through Dorchester and Caroline counties, stopping at safe houses along the way. She crossed into Delaware, a slave state, but one where the free black community was substantial and the Underground Railroad had deep roots. She moved through Wilmington, where a man named Thomas Garrett ran what might be the most well-known stationmaster's operation on the entire Eastern Shore route. Garrett was a Quaker iron merchant who had already been tried and financially ruined for his assistance to freedom seekers, and who had famously told the judge that he intended to continue helping anyone who needed it for as long as he lived. From Wilmington, she moved north across the Pennsylvania border. And when she crossed that line, when the soil under her feet became, legally, free soil, something happened inside her that she described for the rest of her life with the same words, as if no other words could hold it. She said she looked at her hands to see if she was the same person. She said the sun came through the trees and it looked like gold through the leaves, and she felt like she was in heaven. But then she realized that she was alone. That her family was still in Maryland. That the people she loved most in the world were still behind her, still in the darkness, still belonging to someone else. She was in Philadelphia. She was free. And she was already thinking about going back. Let that rest for a moment. She had just crossed 70 or 80 miles of hostile territory, alone, at night, with no map and no guarantee of survival. She had done something that most people who attempted it did not manage to do. And her immediate, overwhelming thought was, this is not enough. There are too many people still behind me. This was the essence of Harriet Tubman. Not the escaping, but the returning. Not the reaching safety, but the going back into danger. Again. And again. And again. She settled briefly in Philadelphia. She found work as a domestic servant, scrubbing floors, cooking, washing clothes, the same labor she had performed in bondage, now performed for wages that were her own to keep. She ate food she had earned. She slept in a room she could leave whenever she chose. She walked down streets without asking permission. Every one of these small, ordinary freedoms was extraordinary to her, a continuous, quiet amazement. But she was lonely in a way she had not anticipated. The people who shared these streets with her, the free black community of Philadelphia, some of them born free, some of them escaped from bondage, some of them only recently settled, were kind. But they were not her people. They were not her mother, her sisters, her brothers, the people whose faces she had known since she could first form memories. She met William Still. This is a name that deserves a moment of attention. William Still was a free black man, born in New Jersey to a father who had escaped slavery in Maryland and a mother who had twice run away and been recaptured. He was the secretary of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, a formally organized group of black and white abolitionists who raised money, arranged lodging, provided clothing, and helped freedom seekers establish new lives in the North. Still kept meticulous records of everyone who passed through, their names, where they came from, what they had endured, where they were going next. He kept these records at considerable personal risk. After the Civil War, he published them, and they became one of the most extraordinary historical documents in American history. William Still's records are part of why we know as much as we do about the people who moved through the Underground Railroad's Eastern Shore routes. And through him, Harriet Tubman found connection to the larger network of people who were doing this dangerous, essential work. She told Still that she was going back for her family. He did not try to dissuade her. He helped her plan. Part 4. The Art of Returning. Most people, having escaped from something that had imprisoned them for 25 years, would not go back. The psychology of survival, of self-preservation, runs very deep. And yet here is what Harriet Tubman did. In the years between 1849 and 1860, she returned to Maryland at least 13 times. 13 journeys south, back into the land where she was legally someone else's property. Back into a place where her face was known, where her distinctive build, she was short, powerfully built, with a straight, quiet gaze that people remembered, could be recognized. Back into a landscape where, after her first successful mission in 1850, her enslaver offered rewards for her capture that grew with each passing year, eventually reaching the extraordinary sum of $40,000. $40,000 in 1856 was an almost incomprehensible amount of money. It would be equivalent to well over $1 million today. It tells you something about how seriously her enslaver, and the Maryland slaveholding class more broadly, took what she was doing. It tells you how many people she had moved, and how completely she had embarrassed and infuriated the system that had held her. But before we reach those later, more elaborate missions, let us stay with the first return. December 1850. 15 months after her own escape. She made contact, through intermediaries, with her niece Keziah Boley. Keziah was enslaved and was about to be sold at auction in Cambridge, along with her 2 young children. Her husband, John Boley, was a free black man, a skilled ship's carpenter who worked on the vessels that moved along the Choptank River. John Boley devised a plan of startling audacity. He submitted a bid for his wife and children at the auction. The auctioneer, assuming he was a legitimate buyer acting on behalf of a white enslaver, accepted the bid. Boley then stalled, telling the auctioneer he needed to go and collect the money from his employer, while Keziah and the children were quietly moved from the auction house to a safe location. When the auctioneer realized what had happened, the Boleys were already hidden. And Harriet was waiting. They moved at night, the Boleys and Harriet together, following the same general northward route that Harriet had traced the year before. But now she was doing it differently. She was doing it with children. Small children, who might cry at a critical moment, who needed to be carried across the creeks, whose presence required a different kind of planning and patience. She developed, over the course of her missions, a set of techniques for managing this. She carried paregoric, a liquid opiate preparation commonly available at the time, which she would use sparingly to help infants sleep through particularly dangerous passages. She chose her timing carefully, always departing on Saturday nights, because there were no newspapers published on Sundays, which meant any advertisement for a runaway couldn't appear until Monday, giving her a crucial head start. She moved in winter, when possible. The cold was harder, yes, and the creeks ran icy and the roads were brutal in the pre-dawn darkness. But winter had advantages. Fewer people were out on the roads. The deciduous trees had lost their leaves, which paradoxically made nighttime navigation easier because the sky was more visible. And the longer nights meant more hours of darkness to travel in before the world woke up. She also, crucially, always moved north on a Saturday. But she sometimes sent the group south first, a day or two of travel in the opposite direction, before turning north. This was counterintuitive, almost perverse in its logic, but it was brilliant. A search party looking for someone heading north would not expect them to appear initially heading south. The Kasaya mission succeeded. The bullies reached Baltimore, where the free black community was substantial enough to hide a small group, and from there, with Harriet's guidance, they made their way to Philadelphia. Harriet went back again the following year. This time, she brought her brother Moses and 2 other men. Then again. She developed a reputation that spread through both the black community of the shore and, with increasing anxiety, among its white enslaving class. There was talk of a mysterious conductor, a woman, some said, though others couldn't believe it, who appeared in the night and led people north. Enslaved people called her by a name she would carry for the rest of her life, Moses. Moses, the liberator of the Israelites from Egypt. The one who walked through the wilderness. The one whose name meant water drawn up, or drawn from water, depending on the translation. It was not a modest comparison, and it was not meant to be modest. The people who gave her that name understood exactly what they were saying. She was leading people out of bondage. She was parting a kind of sea. And she was doing it with an iron, quiet discipline that those who traveled with her would remember for the rest of their lives. She did not allow complaining. She did not allow hesitation at critical moments. She had a saying, which was reported by multiple people who knew her, that became in some ways her most famous utterance: "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." She also had a less comfortable saying. She carried a pistol, a revolver. Later accounts would describe it, though the exact type varied over the years. And she told the people she was guiding that she would use it if she had to. Not on their pursuers. On them, if they decided to turn back. She was not offering a choice about whether to continue once the journey had begun. Turning back meant recapture. And recapture meant being returned to the plantation, where you would be questioned, beaten, and extracted of every piece of information about who had helped you, who had hidden you, where you had sheltered. That information would destroy the network. It would cost other people their lives, their freedom, their safety. The pistol was not cruelty. It was the ruthless mathematics of survival. No one who traveled with Harriet Tubman ever turned back and was captured. Not one, in 13 missions. The arithmetic of that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Part 5: The Stations and the Station Masters. Imagine walking through a very dark house. Not a house you've never been in before, but one you've learned to navigate in total darkness, one you've memorized, step by careful step, so that you know which floorboards creak and which ones don't, where the furniture stands, how many steps it is from the door to the staircase. That is something like what Harriet Tubman's routes through Maryland and Delaware felt like to her by her 3rd or 4th mission. She had internalized them to the point where they were almost instinctual. The body knows what the conscious mind can't afford to think about too long. But along those routes, at irregular intervals, were places where the darkness could be briefly suspended. Where a lamp burned in a window was a signal. Where a knock at the back door would be answered by someone holding food, or a blanket, or dry boots, or simple human acknowledgement. These were the stations of the Underground Railroad. And the people who ran them, the station masters, in the language of the railroad, were remarkable in their own right. Let's walk through some of the specific places and people on Harriet Tubman's Eastern Shore route, because they deserve to be named and understood. They were not merely background figures. They were co-conspirators in one of the most morally necessary conspiracies in American history. The journey north from Dorchester County generally proceeded through several distinct stages. First, the initial movement out of the plantation district, through the marshes and pine forests of the Blackwater area, across or around the Choptank River, into the slightly less surveilled territory of Caroline County to the north and east. This was the most dangerous segment. This was where you were most likely to encounter people who knew your face, where the slave patrollers were most likely to be active, where a dog could pick up your scent from a quarter-mile away if the wind was wrong. One of the earliest stations in Harriet's network was associated with a free black family in the Bucktown area, not far from where she had grown up. The location had the advantage of familiarity. Harriet knew the family, knew the farm, knew the hiding places on it. But it also had the disadvantage of proximity to the plantation. You couldn't stay long. You moved on before the first light. Moving northeast through Caroline County, the route passed through a Quaker-dense corridor that had been part of the Underground Railroad network since the 1780s. The Quakers of Maryland and Delaware had been among the earliest organized opponents of slavery in America. Their religious faith made them willing to act in ways that other sympathizers could not quite manage, because they understood civil disobedience as a form of obedience to a higher authority. Quaker farms along this route were distinguished by their simplicity: white clapboard houses, plain gardens, no ornamentation. A stranger approaching in the dark might knock at the back door and be met by a gray-coated farmer holding a candle, who would say nothing dramatic, nothing memorable, but would gesture toward the barn and return inside. In the barn, beneath the hay or behind the grain bins, there would be bread, and perhaps cheese, and sometimes a dry coat left hanging on a nail. In Delaware, the network thickened. Wilmington was a city with a substantial free black community and a long history of abolitionist activity. The most famous of Harriet's contacts there was Thomas Garrett, whom we have already mentioned. But Garrett was only the most visible node in a much larger structure. Garrett ran an iron and hardware business from a building on Shipley Street in Wilmington. From this building, which looked like nothing more than a prosperous merchant's shop, he funneled money to freedom seekers, arranged transportation north, wrote letters to his network of contacts in Philadelphia, and sometimes literally clothed people in disguise before sending them on. He had been tried in 1848 before Harriet's first arrival under the Fugitive Slave Act, found guilty, and fined so heavily that he was financially ruined. Standing in the courthouse, he had said to the assembled court, and I am paraphrasing his recorded words, "I say to you and to all in this courtroom that if anyone knows a fugitive who wants a shelter and a friend, send him to Thomas Garrett and he will befriend him." He rebuilt his business and continued his work until the Civil War ended it by force of law. In Philadelphia, the Vigilance Committee was the central organizing force. William Still, as we have noted, kept the records that would eventually become historical treasure. But there were dozens of others, committee members, donors, people who gave rooms in their houses, who traveled to the edges of the city to meet arriving groups, who wrote false letters of reference for freedom seekers seeking employment. Harriet moved between all of these nodes with the confidence of someone who had memorized not just the geography but the sociology of the corridor. She knew which of Garrett's neighbors might be watching. She knew the best time of day to arrive at the Philadelphia station. She knew which committee members to contact and in what order. She also knew, acutely, that after 1850 Philadelphia was no longer far enough. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a catastrophe for the Underground Railroad. Under the new law, federal commissioners were appointed to adjudicate claims that a person in a free state was actually an escaped slave, and these commissioners were paid more if they ruled in favor of the claimant than if they ruled in favor of the accused. The law also required ordinary citizens in free states, not just slave states, to assist in the capture and return of freedom seekers. Resistance carried heavy penalties. The result was terror in northern black communities. People who had been living freely in Philadelphia or New York or Boston for years, who had built lives, started families, found work, were suddenly vulnerable to capture by Southern enslavers who had only to present a description and a claim to a federal commissioner. Many fled further north. Some fled to Canada, where American law had no reach. Harriet Tubman reorganized her network accordingly. From 1850 onward, she was guiding people not just to Philadelphia but all the way to Canada, specifically, in most cases, to St. Catharines, Ontario, a small city just across the border from Niagara Falls, where a community of freedom seekers had established themselves under the leadership of black church organizations and with the support of sympathetic Canadian citizens. Canada. A country whose name, when whispered in a Maryland slave cabin, carried the same compressed weight as those earlier whispered words: Delaware, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. The weight of a word that meant, beyond reach. Beyond the law that constrains you. Beyond. Part 6, The Language of the Dark. There is a question that historians have wrestled with for generations, and it is one worth sitting with quietly before we move forward. How did people communicate? In a world where literacy was often denied to enslaved people, where letters could be read by anyone who intercepted them, where every spoken word risked being overheard by someone who might use it against you, how did Harriet Tubman tell someone she was coming? How did a freedom seeker, in a cabin in Dorchester County, know to be ready? The answer is a constellation of methods, each one indirect, each one carrying its meaning below the surface, each one deniable if found. Songs were among the most important. The African American spiritual tradition had developed, over generations, a profound capacity for double meaning. Songs that spoke to the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt, to the promised land beyond the River Jordan, to Moses and the parting of the waters. These songs were also maps, announcements, instructions. They said things that could not be said directly. Wade in the water was, among other things, an instruction. Wade in the water, children. God's gonna trouble the water. It meant, go in the river, travel in the water, break your scent trail so the dogs can't follow. It was practical wisdom wrapped in the language of faith. Follow the drinking gourd was astronomical navigation. The drinking gourd was the Big Dipper, whose outer edge points to Polaris, the North Star. The song described following this star north, and following the river that runs north, and finding the place where two rivers run together, and meeting the man who would guide you the rest of the way. It was, in some interpretations, a literal route map encoded in verse. There is scholarly debate about how precisely to read these songs as navigation tools, and about when exactly each song was composed and how widely it circulated. But there is no serious doubt that the spiritual tradition provided cover and communication for the Underground Railroad in ways that those outside it could not easily decode. Quilts are another piece of this story, though again the historical evidence is sometimes disputed. The tradition of quilts as directional codes, specific patterns hung on a clothesline indicating safe passage, hidden rooms, direction of travel, was described by some former freedom seekers and by community oral tradition, though the written historical record is thinner than many people believe. What we can say with confidence is that quilts were indeed part of the visual language of African American communities, and that certain patterns carried particular significance that outsiders were not meant to understand. There was also a network of trusted human messengers. People who moved between the plantation district and the free communities with some degree of legitimacy, preachers, skilled workers, hired out artisans who had passes allowing them to travel, could carry information encoded in conversation, in the passing of small objects, in a particular greeting or a particular way of holding a hand. Harriet Tubman herself communicated with people on the Eastern Shore through a web of intermediaries, most of whom are unnamed in the historical record because naming them would have been dangerous, and because many of them were deliberately never named even in the private letters and diaries that survived. She sent word through trusted people, sometimes free black men who traveled between the shore and the north for business, sometimes sympathetic white Quakers who could move more freely. One of the most important of these intermediaries was Jacob Jackson, a free black man in Dorchester County who was literate, itself a remarkable and carefully guarded fact in that world. Jackson received a letter, ostensibly from his adopted son William, that read in part, "Read my letter to the old folks, and give my love to them, and tell my brothers to be always watching and to prayer, and when the good old ship of Zion comes along, to be ready to step aboard." When the local postmaster read the letter, he could not make any sense of it. He called Jackson in for questioning. Jackson read it, shook his head, and said he didn't know what it meant, that his son must have written to the wrong person. The postmaster let him go. But Jackson understood exactly what it meant. It meant that Harriet was coming. It meant that the people she wanted to take north, his brothers and their companions, should be ready. And they were. There is something deeply moving about this, if you let yourself feel it slowly. These were people who had been systematically denied literacy, denied freedom of movement, denied the most basic rights of selfhood, and they had built, inside those constraints, an entire parallel language of survival. A language made of songs and patches of cloth and the particular placement of a lantern in a window. A language that lives, fragments of it, in the historical record, and that carried dozens of people to freedom. Part 7. The Faces of Those She Carried. We have spoken about Harriet Tubman's routes and methods in a somewhat abstract way. But every mission she ran was not a route. It was a group of people. Specific human beings, with specific fears and specific hopes and specific bodies that got cold and hungry and exhausted in specific ways. Let us slow down and look at some of them. Because the history of the Underground Railroad is not only Harriet Tubman's story. It is also the story of those who trusted her enough to step into the darkness with her. In December of 1854, Harriet made what is perhaps her most audacious single mission. She returned to the Eastern Shore to bring out 3 of her brothers, Benjamin, Henry, and William Henry Ross. This mission had particular emotional weight, because her brothers' hesitation had caused them to turn back on her very first escape 5 years earlier. Now they were ready. But the timing was exceptionally dangerous. It was Christmas, which provided some cover. The slaveholder's household would be occupied with holiday activities, servants and hired people would be moving about more freely than usual, but it also meant that the family was all gathered together, which heightened the risk of being noticed. Harriet's father, Ben Ross, was by this time free. His enslaver had emancipated him, in accordance with the terms of an old deed, when Ross reached the age of 45. He was living in a small house near the plantation. Harriet wanted desperately to see him. But she could not let him see her brothers, because she did not want him to be complicit. Specifically, she did not want him to have to lie to a court about whether he had seen his sons, which would have required him to either perjure himself or to betray them. This detail, the father with his hands over his eyes, blind by choice, protecting himself and his children simultaneously, is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire history of Harriet Tubman's missions. It tells you more about the moral world of slavery than almost anything else I could describe. The way it forced people into impossible performances of ignorance. The way it turned love itself into a kind of legal strategy. The three brothers moved north with Harriet through the holiday darkness. They traveled by foot, by wagon when they could arrange it, through the familiar landscape of Dorchester and Caroline counties and into Delaware. They spent time hidden with Thomas Garrett in Wilmington. They reached Philadelphia and eventually continued north. William Henry Ross was particularly frightened throughout the journey. He had a wife, Catherine, who was pregnant, and leaving her was an anguish that walked with him through every mile of the route. He went anyway. He sent for Catherine later, as so many freedom seekers sent for the people they had left behind, hoping the network would carry them north too. Let us also pause for a moment on the story of a man named Joe Bailey, one of the most sought-after freedom seekers on Harriet Tubman's 1856 mission. Joe Bailey was a large, powerfully built man who had been enslaved on the eastern shore and who was known for his strength and his skill. His enslaver had recently sold him, or arranged to sell him, to a Deep South cotton operation, the exact fate that terrified every person on the Upper South. Joe Bailey knew that this transfer was coming, and he made his decision. He joined Harriet's group in the fall of 1856. There were several others with them. The exact number varies in different historical accounts, but it was a larger group than Harriet usually preferred. Large groups were harder to hide, harder to move, more conspicuous on the roads. They were pursued. There is a specific account of this pursuit in Thomas Garrett's correspondence. Garrett received a letter from Harriet asking him to send help, describing that her group was being followed and needed assistance further down the Delaware corridor. Garrett sent a man with a wagon, disguised as a farmer going to market. Joe Bailey reached Canada. He wrote back to his former enslaver, in a letter that was saved and later published, in which he described his freedom in terms that are almost painful to read in their controlled, precise dignity. He described the fact that he could now go where he pleased. That he could earn wages and keep them. That he was not afraid. He was not afraid. 3 words. Carrying the weight of a lifetime in which fear had been the constant, unavoidable companion of every waking moment. There were women in these groups too, of course. Women with children, women alone, women whose stories were often less legible in the historical record than those of the men, because the conventions of the time made women's stories less likely to be written down or preserved. But they were there. A woman named Mary Manoke. A woman described only as a woman with a baby in one of Garrett's letters, who crossed Delaware in January with an infant wrapped in her coat. A woman who made the crossing alone, 8 months pregnant, whose name no one recorded, who presumably gave birth somewhere north of the Pennsylvania line and whose child became the first of a new generation, born free. Each of these people is a universe of experience that the historical record barely glimpses. But Harriet Tubman knew them. She walked with them through the night. She heard their breathing change when they were afraid. She held their hands when they faltered. She told them firmly, quietly, without sentimentality, to keep moving. Just keep moving. Part 8, The Marshal and the Bounty. By 1856 or 1857, the bounty on Harriet Tubman's head had become one of the most famous facts about the Underground Railroad in both the North and the South. $40,000, some accounts said. Others said $12,000 or $18,000. The numbers varied because the rewards were sometimes offered by different parties, by the Broaddus estate, by individual enslavers whose people she had taken, by Maryland state authorities. What is beyond dispute is that she was being actively sought. That her name was known to slave catchers and federal marshals operating throughout the Eastern Shore corridor. That descriptions of her circulated, short, dark-skinned, with a scar on her temple where the lead weight had struck her, with the distinctive slight sleepiness around her eyes that was a remnant of her neurological condition. And yet she kept coming back. This is the part of Harriet Tubman's story that requires the most careful attention, because it is the part most easily sentimentalized into pure heroism, which does it a disservice. She was not simply brave in the way that the word brave is used in children's books. She was operating within a fully developed and deeply considered strategic framework. She varied her routes. She never used the same path twice in exactly the same sequence. She sometimes moved east, toward the coast, rather than north, before turning north, adding miles in time but shedding pursuers who expected a straight northward line. She used disguises, men's clothing, an old woman's bonnet and shawl, the stooped posture and slow shuffling gait of someone old and harmless and utterly unremarkable. She once, according to one of the most famous stories about her, sat on a railroad platform in disguise, holding a newspaper open in front of her face. She had been told that a man who was looking for her had boarded the same train. She sat there, apparently absorbed in the newspaper, for the duration of the station stop, until the train moved and the danger had passed. The irony of this story, which multiple sources record in slightly different forms, is that she may not have been able to read the newspaper she was holding. Or perhaps by then she could read somewhat, having taught herself over the years in the North. The gesture itself was the disguise. A woman reading a newspaper was not a frightened fugitive. She was a respectable free person going about her business. She also understood, with extraordinary sophistication, the psychology of her pursuers. She knew that slave catchers expected freedom seekers to travel alone or in very small groups, to move only at night, to be obviously terrified. So she sometimes moved with a group in broad daylight, dressed in work clothes, appearing to be a gang of laborers heading from one job to the next. Obvious, unremarkable, unmemorable. She knew that pursuers expected people to move as fast as possible away from the plantation. So she sometimes moved south first, as we have noted, before turning north. She knew that the day after a Saturday departure was the most dangerous, because that was when the alert would go out and the initial search would begin. So she was always far enough north by Sunday that the initial search parties were looking in the wrong place. She also understood the value of what we might now call operational security, the absolute necessity of limiting the information that any single person in the network possessed. She told no one the details of any mission until it was underway. She told the people she was guiding only what they needed to know to take the next step, not the whole route, not the names of all the stations, not the full plan. This was not distrust. It was protection. A person who doesn't know something cannot reveal it under duress. The federal marshals and slave catchers who pursued her were not stupid men. They were, in many cases, professional trackers with local knowledge, dogs trained for the work, and the full backing of the law. The Fugitive Slave Act gave them enormous power, the power to enter homes, to compel assistance, to arrest people on suspicion alone. They operated networks of informants in both the free black communities of the North and the enslaved communities of the South, people who could be bought with a small reward or coerced with the threat of violence. That Harriet Tubman evaded all of them, for 11 years, is not luck. It is not simply courage. It is the product of a systematic, rigorous, continually evolving intelligence about who was looking for her, how they thought, what they expected, and how to give them none of it. She was also helped, in ways she fully acknowledged, by what she called the hand of God. By the visions that came to her in her sleeping moments, sudden, vivid, specific images of danger and of safety, of which path to take and which to avoid. She trusted these completely. And the historical record, insofar as it can be read at this distance, suggests she was right to trust them. She turned groups away from routes that later turned out to have marshals waiting on them. She chose crossing points on rivers that, by any conventional calculation, seemed riskier but that proved safer than the obvious route. Whether you attribute this to divine guidance, to subconscious pattern recognition drawn from years of observation and experience, or to some combination of the two, the practical result was the same. She was never caught. Not once. Part 9: The North Star and the Woman Who Followed It. There is a quality of the North Star, Polaris, that is worth taking a moment to appreciate, not astronomically but experientially. On a clear night in the mid-19th century, far from any artificial light, it was not the brightest star in the sky. It was steady. While all the other stars wheeled slowly around it through the hours of the night, Polaris held its position. Fixed. Reliable. Always north. For enslaved people navigating north, this was not a metaphor. It was a practical instrument. The star that never moves told you which direction you were going. It was free information available to anyone who could look up, regardless of who owned the land they were standing on or whether they were permitted to travel the road they were walking. Frederick Douglass had himself escaped from slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland. He too was from that flat, marsh-cut landscape, that same world of tidal rivers and pine forests. He understood, with the intimacy of personal experience, exactly what Harriet had crossed and recrossed. His letter to her is not a formal tribute. It is the recognition of one survivor by another. By the late 1850s, Harriet Tubman had moved her base of operations from Philadelphia, which had become too dangerous after the 1850 Act, to St. Catharines, Ontario, the small Canadian city that served as the northern terminus of her route. St. Catharines sat on the western edge of the Niagara Peninsula, just across the Niagara River from New York State, close enough to the border that you could feel the proximity of the two worlds in the air. In St. Catharines, there was a community of freedom seekers who had been arriving for years, from Maryland, from Virginia, from North Carolina, from across the Upper South. They had built churches, established schools, started businesses, created the infrastructure of a new community from the ground up. The Salem Chapel of the British Methodist Episcopal Church was one of the centers of this community, a modest wooden building that served as meeting place, social hub, and symbol of permanence. Harriet worshipped there when she was in St. Catherine's. She brought the people she carried directly to the church, sometimes in the final miles of a mission. The contrast between where they had started, crouching in a root cellar in Dorchester County, listening for dogs, and where they ended, standing in a warm church with community around them and Canadian air coming through the winter windows, was the entire distance of a world. She met the leading figures of the abolitionist movement during these years. She met Thomas Garrett, of course, many times. She met William Still. She met Jermaine Logan, the escaped slave who had become a bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Syracuse and who ran his own underground railroad station there. She met Gerrit Smith, the New York philanthropist whose wealth funded much of the abolitionist infrastructure. She met William Henry Seward, who would go on to serve as Lincoln's Secretary of State, and who sold her a house in Auburn, New York, on generous terms specifically because he admired her work. And she met John Brown. John Brown is one of the most contested figures in American history. To those who opposed slavery, he was a prophet, a martyr, a man who understood that the moral enormity of the institution required a response proportional to its horror. To those who supported slavery, he was a terrorist, a murderer, a man whose 1859 raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry was an act of insurrection against the constitutional order. Brown called Harriet Tubman General Tubman. He said she was one of the best and bravest persons on this continent. He consulted her about his plans, asked her to help recruit men for what would become the Harper's Ferry raid, sought her geographic knowledge of the Eastern Shore. She was not at Harper's Ferry. She was sick, one of her uncontrollable sleeping episodes, or possibly a more serious illness, and could not travel. History sometimes turns on things as small as that. Whether her presence would have changed the outcome of the raid, whether her extraordinary tactical intelligence might have salvaged something from Brown's plan, is impossible to know. What we know is that when Brown was hanged, in December of 1859, Harriet mourned him with an intensity that she described as personal grief. Not because she endorsed everything he had done, but because she understood why he had done it, from the inside, in the way that only someone who had lived within the thing he was trying to destroy could understand. Part 10: The Last Mission and the War That Freed the Road. By 1860, Harriet Tubman's underground missions were drawing to a close, though she did not know it yet. She made what would be her final rescue mission in December of 1860, just months before the Civil War began. The person she went for was her sister Rachel, and Rachel's two children, Ben and Angerine. She had been trying to reach Rachel for years. Every mission had, in part, been oriented around the possibility of bringing her sister out. On this last mission, something went wrong. The details are not entirely clear in the historical record, but Rachel was not able to come. Perhaps she had been moved, perhaps the timing failed, perhaps she was too frightened at the critical moment. Harriet returned north without her sister, carrying instead a group of other freedom seekers who had been waiting for their chance. Rachel never made it out. She died in bondage. The sister that Harriet had been going back for, again and again, through 11 years of dangerous missions, was never freed. This was the great unresolved grief at the center of Harriet Tubman's work, the one she could not save. The one the network couldn't reach. She would carry that grief for the rest of a very long life. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Civil War began. It changed everything about the geography of slavery and freedom, though it did not change it instantly or completely or without enormous cost. Harriet Tubman's skills, her knowledge of Southern geography, her ability to move quietly through enemy territory, her network of contacts and informants, her absolute steadiness under pressure were immediately recognized by the Union military as assets. She went south again, but now in a different capacity. She went to Beaufort, South Carolina, in 1862, as part of the Union occupation of the Sea Islands. She worked initially as a nurse and a cook, caring for the freed people who were flooding into Union lines, people whose bodies bore the marks of years of labor and abuse, who were sick and starving and disoriented. She organized other freed women to work with her, setting up a laundry service and a food preparation operation that served both the military and the refugee population. But she was also, from very early in her time in South Carolina, gathering intelligence. She was working as a spy. The Union Army was deeply interested in Confederate positions along the inland waterways, the creeks and rivers that wound through the low country of coastal South Carolina. These waterways were difficult to navigate without local knowledge, and the Confederate forces understood them far better than the Union did in those early months of the war. Harriet organized a network of Black Scouts, men who had been enslaved on the local plantations and who knew every creek, every sandbar, every Confederate fortification along the rivers. She processed their information, synthesized it, and delivered it to Union commanders. She worked in direct coordination with Colonel James Montgomery, an abolitionist officer who had fought with John Brown in Kansas. On the night of June 1 to 2, 1863, Harriet Tubman led Colonel Montgomery and approximately 150 black Union soldiers, members of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, up the Combahee River in 3 gunboats. She had spent weeks gathering intelligence about where Confederate torpedoes, mines, had been placed in the river. The gunboats navigated around every one of them, following her directions. The Combahee River raid destroyed Confederate rice plantations and supply depots along a 30-mile stretch of the river. It freed approximately 750 enslaved people, who rushed to the riverbanks when they heard the gunboats coming and pressed aboard in such numbers that the boats rode low in the water. Children were handed up over the rails. Women climbed aboard still carrying the pots they had been cooking in. Old men and women were helped aboard by the soldiers. Harriet stood at the bow of the lead gunboat and watched them come. She later described the scene to a journalist. Kate Clifford Larson and Catherine Clinton, among other biographers, have written about this description at length. She spoke of the chaos and the joy of it, the uncontrollable, overwhelming surge of people toward freedom. She spoke about it with the particular tone of someone who had orchestrated smaller versions of this scene many times before, in the dark, in the cold, in the silence, but who had never seen it happen at this scale, in daylight, with an army behind her. The Combahee River Raid was the largest single liberation event in the history of the Underground Railroad's successor, the Union Army's liberation campaigns. And it was planned and guided by a woman who had learned to read rivers and marshes in Maryland, decades earlier, as a child. The skills were identical. The scale was just different. Part 11: What She Left Behind, and What Remained. The Civil War ended in April 1865, with the surrender of Confederate General Robert East Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. 3 months later, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, formally abolishing slavery throughout the United States. Harriet Tubman was 42 or 43 years old. She had been living as a free person for 16 years. She had run 13 missions into the South. She had guided, the number most historians accept, somewhere between 70 and 80 people out of bondage, though some accounts credit her with more. She had served the Union Army for 3 years as nurse, spy, and military guide. She had liberated 750 people in a single night. She returned to Auburn, New York, where she had lived since William Henry Seward had sold her a house there in 1859. Auburn was a small city in central New York State, in the Finger Lakes region, a place of quiet hills and long narrow lakes reflecting the sky. It was a substantial distance from the eastern shore where she had been born, and from the Canadian border where she had brought so many people to safety. It was, perhaps deliberately, a place that felt like neither of those extremes. A middle place. A settling place. But Harriet Tubman's life after the Civil War was not quiet in the way one might expect of someone who had done what she had done and earned the right to rest. She returned to Auburn in 1865 to find that she had no money. The Union Army had never formally employed her. She had worked as a volunteer, or at best as an informally contracted assistant, and had never paid her a consistent wage. She was owed back wages that were never delivered. The pension she was eventually entitled to as a widow. She had married a man named Nelson Davis in 1869, a former Union soldier who had predeceased her. Took decades of petitioning Congress before it was finally granted, and even then it came at a fraction of what she was owed. This financial struggle is its own kind of American story, and it is not a comfortable one. The country that she had served, in ways that went far beyond what any law or contract required of her, left her to manage as best she could. She grew food in her garden. She raised pigs. She took in boarders. She sold vegetables door to door in Auburn. She accepted donations from abolitionists who understood what she had done and felt some obligation to acknowledge it. She also took in those who needed care. People who were old and sick and had nowhere else to go, white and black alike, found their way to her house and were received. She was not wealthy enough to be generous in the conventional sense. She was generous anyway. She became deeply involved in the women's suffrage movement in the years after the Civil War. She attended suffrage conventions, gave speeches, argued for the right of women, including and especially black women, to vote. She spoke at a convention in Washington alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She spoke bluntly about the double burden of those who were denied rights on the basis of both race and sex. The suffrage movement would not see its goal achieved until 1920, the year after Harriet Tubman died. She did not live to cast a vote in a federal election. This is another of the painful ironies that gather around her story like weather. Her mother, Rit, the woman whose name she had taken, whose fierce and tender love had anchored her through everything, eventually came north. Ben Ross too. Harriet brought them to Auburn, where they lived out the rest of their lives in the house their daughter had bought on generous terms from a future Secretary of State. They died free. They died with their daughter's hand, presumably, close by. She outlived most of her generation. She lived to see the world she had spent her life trying to change actually change, incompletely, imperfectly, with enormous violence and enormous loss along the way, but changed nonetheless. She lived to see black men vote, and then to see that right taken away by Jim Crow. She lived to see the flowering of the post-war Reconstruction period and its brutal suppression. She lived through all of it, small and straight and calm, in her house in Auburn, tending her garden and receiving visitors and occasionally falling into the sudden, uncontrollable sleep that had marked her since she was 13 years old. In 1903, she donated land adjacent to her house to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church for the establishment of a home for elderly African Americans. The home opened in 1908, 5 years before her death. She visited it often in the years that remained to her, sitting with the residents, talking, listening. She died on March 10, 1913. She was approximately 90 years old. Her last words, to the family and friends gathered around her, were, "I go to prepare a place for you." It was the language of John, the Gospel of John, where Jesus tells his disciples he is going ahead to prepare a dwelling for them. But it was also, more simply, the language of someone who had spent her life doing exactly that, going ahead, into the dark, to prepare the way for those who came behind her. Part 12, What the Darkness Holds. There is something that happens to. Part 12, What the Darkness Holds. There is something that happens to a landscape when you know its history deeply enough. The Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Dorchester County, Maryland, looks like wilderness now. From the observation platforms along Wildlife Drive, you can see nothing but marsh grass and open water, great blue herons standing motionless in the shallows, bald eagles turning in the gray autumn sky. The loblolly pines are dark and still on the western edge of the marsh. The light in late afternoon has a flat, pewter quality, coming off the water at a low angle, diffuse and even and somehow ancient. It looks like a place where nothing has happened. A place that has always been empty. But this is the land where Harriet Tubman was born. Where she worked, and suffered, and learned. Where she first looked north at the stars and understood that the steadiness of one particular light was a direction she could follow. The marsh grass under your feet, if you left the boardwalk and walked into it, would be the same marsh grass her feet disturbed in the early morning hours of September 1849 when she began her first walk toward freedom. The darkness holds things. It holds the specific weight of the past, compressed into ordinary-looking places, available to anyone who knows how to look. This final part of our journey is about what Harriet Tubman's story means when you hold it still and look at it from a distance. About the specific texture of the world she inhabited and the world she made possible. About the people who were part of her network whose names we know only partially, or not at all. About what it means to be brave in the quiet, sustained, unglamorous way that she was brave, not in a single dramatic moment, but across an entire lifetime of choosing, again and again, to go back into the dark. Let us begin with the landscape one more time, because the geography of the Eastern Shore shaped everything about how this story unfolded, and its specific details deserve more attention than they usually receive. In Harriet Tubman's time, this landscape was more heavily forested than it is today. Climate change and sea level rise have drowned considerable areas of the Eastern Shore's low-lying forest over the last century, creating the open marsh expanses that characterize the wildlife refuge now. In the 1840s, there would have been more tree cover, more shade, more places to disappear. The roads of Dorchester County in that era were simple dirt affairs, deeply rutted in wet weather and choking with dust in dry spells. The main road north ran through Cambridge and then through the small settlement of Choptank, now the town of Preston, and on through Caroline County toward the Delaware border. Roughly 70 miles from Cambridge to Wilmington, Delaware, on routes that were not straight lines but followed the curves of the land and the placement of the few river crossings. 70 miles on foot, at night, in winter, with children, while being searched for. It takes a moment to actually imagine this, not as a historical fact but as a physical experience. The cold air coming off the marsh. The mud pulling at your feet on the unpaved roads. The sound of a dog in the distance, not necessarily following you, but possibly. The way exhaustion starts in your legs and moves upward through your body as the hours of the night wear on. The particular misery of wet feet in January. And through all of that, Harriet Tubman's quiet, forward-facing calm. Move. Keep moving. We rest when it's safe. It's not safe yet. Move. The human capacity for sustained endurance under conditions of extreme threat is something that psychologists and historians have tried to understand for generations. What enables one person to keep functioning, to keep making clear decisions, to keep protecting others, in circumstances that would paralyze most people? What combination of personality, experience, faith, and sheer physical resilience produced a person like Harriet Tubman? There is no simple answer. But there are some elements worth naming. Her faith was not decorative. It was not the faith of someone who believed in God in the abstract, who prayed on Sundays and lived the rest of the week by purely secular calculations. It was operational faith. The kind of faith that changes what you are able to do, because it changes what you believe is possible. She genuinely believed that God was guiding her through the visions that came in her sleeping episodes, through the intuitions that she learned to trust absolutely, and this belief meant that the question of whether to go back was never really a question about her own safety. It was a question about whether she was being called to go. And when the call came, she went. The neurological dimension of this deserves one more moment of attention, because it is genuinely remarkable in ways that are easy to miss. The injury she received at 13 years old, the blow to the head from the lead weight, caused a condition that was dangerous, unpredictable, and deeply limiting in some ways. She could fall asleep mid-sentence, mid-stride, at any moment. In the middle of a forest at 2 a.m, with a group of frightened people depending on her, this could have been catastrophic. And yet the people who traveled with her, the people who knew her over decades of her public life, the people who heard her speak at abolitionist gatherings, all of them described the same thing. When she came back from those episodes, she was not disoriented. She was not confused or frightened or weakened. She was, if anything, calmer than she had been before. As if the sleep had refreshed something in her that other people refreshed through ordinary rest. She seemed to have made peace with the condition so completely that it no longer frightened her. And when the people she was guiding saw that she was not afraid of it, when she came back from an episode and simply said, "All right, let's move," and started walking again, they took their cue from her and were not afraid either. This is leadership in its most elemental form. Not the management of resources or the issuance of commands, but the embodied demonstration of a capacity that others can then borrow. She showed them, in her body, what it looked like not to be paralyzed by fear. And they learned from the showing. Now let us turn to the larger network, the people behind and around and alongside Harriet Tubman who have received less attention in the historical memory but who were essential to everything she did. We have mentioned Thomas Garrett, William Still, Germaine Logan, and a handful of others. But the actual network was far wider and more complex than these named individuals suggest. Historical work by scholars including Kate Clifford Larson, Catherine Clinton, and Eric Foner, among others, has done much to expand our understanding of who was involved and how. On the Eastern Shore itself, the free black community was absolutely indispensable. In 1850, approximately 30% of Maryland's black population was free, a much higher proportion than in the Deep South. This substantial free black community was the water in which the Underground Railroad swam. They provided the safe houses closest to the plantation districts, the ones where the risk was greatest. They provided the intelligence about which roads were being watched, which slave catchers were in the area, which white families in the county could be counted on for indifference if not active support. Many of these free black families were themselves living in precarious conditions. Free status on the Eastern Shore did not mean genuine freedom in any meaningful social sense. Free black men and women were subject to curfews, required to carry papers proving their status at all times, denied the right to vote, denied access to most skilled occupations, and vulnerable to being pressed back into slavery if someone was willing to challenge their legal standing. Helping an escaped enslaved person risked everything they had, which was usually not much, but which was the whole of their lives. They helped anyway. There were white people too, beyond the Quaker community, who provided assistance. Some of them were motivated by religious conviction. Some by political opposition to slavery. Some by personal relationships with the black people in their communities, employers who developed genuine regard for the free black workers they hired, neighbors who had known each other for years and who chose relationship over law. These motivations were not always pure or consistently principled. Some people helped out of a particular pragmatic calculation. They believed slavery was wrong but were not committed abolitionists, and when faced with a specific person in specific need, they made a choice. Individual, contingent, quiet. Not heroic in any grand sense, but essential in its aggregate. The Delaware Corridor deserves particular attention because it was, geographically and logistically, perhaps the most critical segment of the route. Delaware was a slave state, but one with a very small enslaved population by the mid-19th century, fewer than 2,000 enslaved people and a state population of more than 90,000. The free black community was proportionally large and well organized. The Quaker presence was strong. And the state's geography, a narrow peninsula between the Delaware River and the Chesapeake Bay, meant that the route north was relatively compact and well-defined. Wilmington sat at the northern end of Delaware, just a few miles from the Pennsylvania border. Thomas Garrett's operation there was remarkable not only for its scale but for its duration. He helped freedom seekers for decades, through financial ruin, through constant surveillance, through the explicit threats of pro-slavery activists who knew exactly what he was doing. He helped approximately 2,700 people over the course of his life. 2,700. A number that is almost too large to hold in the mind as a collection of individual human stories. He and Harriet Tubman shared a deep mutual respect that comes through clearly in the letters that survived. He called her Moses in his correspondence, using the name the black community had given her. He described her, in one letter to a Philadelphia contact, as a woman of no common mind and courage, one who had already assisted many to reach freedom. He meant it as simple statement of fact, not as praise, it was just what she was. In Philadelphia, the Vigilance Committee operated under considerable public pressure. The city's white population was divided on the question of slavery. There was a substantial pro-slavery or at least pro-accommodation faction, particularly among merchants whose business interests were tied to the Southern cotton economy. The committee's members were regularly threatened, sometimes physically harassed, and constantly watched by informants employed by Southern slaveholders. And yet they persisted. William still kept his records. The committee raised money, found lodging, provided clothing, arranged onward travel. They were extraordinary ordinary people, a phrase that is not a contradiction, but a description of the specific character of moral courage that is exercised not in a single dramatic moment but in the sustained, unglamorous, daily practice of doing what is right in the face of what is safe. Beyond Philadelphia, the route north had additional nodes. In Syracuse, New York, a city that had declared itself a sanctuary for freedom seekers, in explicit defiance of the Fugitive Slave Act. Jermaine Logan ran a station with the full knowledge and support of the city's black community and much of its white community. In 1851, when a freedom seeker named Jerry Henry was arrested in Syracuse under the Fugitive Slave Act, a crowd of hundreds stormed the police station and freed him. He was subsequently carried to Canada. The event became known as the Jerry Rescue and was celebrated annually in Syracuse for decades. This was not Harriet Tubman's work directly, but it was the same current of moral courage running through a different part of the same river. The Underground Railroad was not one person. It was a current that moved through thousands of people, carrying others along with it, finding its own way around the obstacles that the law and the slave power placed in its path. Harriet Tubman was, to extend the metaphor one more time, not the river. She was the strongest part of the current. The place where the water moved fastest and most purposefully, where the force of the thing was most concentrated and most effective. Let us also sit for a moment with the stories of those who tried and did not succeed. Because Harriet Tubman's 13 successful missions, in which not a single person was ever caught or turned back, can create a distorted picture of how the Underground Railroad worked overall. People who were caught were punished severely. Whipping, increased surveillance, sail further south, these were the standard consequences of a failed escape. The threat of sail south was particularly effective because it dissolved every personal tie a person had built, removed them from the landscape they knew, and placed them in a world that was, by every account, even more brutal than the Eastern Shore's slave system. Some people made multiple attempts before succeeding. Some made multiple attempts and never succeeded. These unnamed, unrecorded people, whose courage was as real as that of those who made it out, deserve their own moment of acknowledgement in any honest telling of this history. And there were those who chose resistance of a different kind, those who stayed, who found ways to maintain human dignity within bondage, who organized within the community, who preserved culture and language and faith and family bonds across the enormous pressure that the system put on all of those things. The decision to stay and endure and resist from within was not cowardice. It was a different calculation, made in full awareness of the costs, that also deserves respect. Harriet Tubman herself understood this. She was not contemptuous of those who chose not to run. She was impatient with them sometimes. Her pistol and her saying about not losing passengers reflects a certain steeliness about what she required of those who committed to a mission. But she did not judge those who decided the risk was too great or the ties too strong or the terror too overwhelming. She had been one of them, once. She had grown up in that world of constrained choices and terrible calculations. She knew what it cost to make the decision to move. One of the aspects of Harriet Tubman's story that receives insufficient attention is the role of her father, Ben Ross. We mentioned him earlier in the context of the Christmas 1854 mission, when he covered his eyes so that he could truthfully say he had not seen who was in his house. But Ben Ross's contribution to the Underground Railroad was deeper and more sustained than that single gesture. Ben Ross was free, as we noted. He had been promised freedom under the terms of a deed written by his former enslaver, Anthony Thompson, and the promise had been kept when Ross turned 45. But his wife Red and all of his children were still enslaved under the Brodess estate. Ross was an exceptional woodsman, a skill he passed to his daughter, and he worked in the timber operations that fed the shipbuilding industry on the Chesapeake. This gave him a degree of mobility and economic standing unusual among free black men on the shore. He used it. He was part of the information network that Harriet relied on, a local contact who could observe and report on conditions on the shore, who could receive coded letters and understand their meaning, who could provide the small but essential assistance, a meal, a hiding place, a direction that kept missions functioning. He settled in St. Catharines for a time, and later in Auburn. He lived to old age in the house his daughter owned. He had given his children to the forest and the darkness and the long road north, and they had made it through. There is a detail from Ben Ross's life that I want to linger on because it contains something essential about what this story is about. The same logic, the same irresistible pull of love and connection, is what drove Harriet back into Maryland 13 times. It was not abstract moral principle that sent her south again. It was her mother's face. Her brothers' names. The specific, particular people she was bound to by the accidents of birth and the deeper bonds of choice and memory. This is, when you trace it to its root, what the Underground Railroad was made of. Not ideology. Not organization. Love. The specific, stubborn, dangerous love of particular people for other particular people, enacted in the darkness of a Maryland night, step by careful step, northward under the fixed light of Polaris. There is a final image I want to leave you with before we close. In 2017, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park was established in Maryland, centered on the landscape of Dorchester County where she was born and from which she escaped. The park includes the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Visitor Center, a building set among trees at the edge of the marsh, from which you can look out across the same flat, water-cut land that she crossed in the darkness. When you stand at the windows of that visitor center at dusk, at the particular moment when the sun has gone below the western horizon but the sky still holds a deep blue glow, you can see the marsh grass moving in the wind. You can see the dark line of the pines to the west. You can see, overhead, if you tilt your head back, the first stars beginning to appear. If the night is clear and you wait long enough, you will see Polaris. The North Star. Exactly where it has always been. It has not moved. It will not move. It is still north. And somewhere in the darkness below it, in the memory of this landscape, a small woman is still walking. Moving quietly through the marsh grass. Listening for dogs. Looking up, briefly, to check her direction. And then looking forward again, toward the tree line, toward the road, toward the next safe house, toward the north. She never stopped. Not really. History has a way of keeping certain people in motion long after their bodies have been stilled. And Harriet Tubman, in the darkness of the eastern shore that she knew better than anyone else alive, is still moving. Still bringing people through. Closing meditation. Let the story settle now, like sediment in still water. Let it come to rest. You are still here. In your bed, on your couch, in the warmth of wherever you have made your resting place tonight. The world outside is quiet, or nearly quiet. Whatever darkness is outside your windows is a gentle one. A sleeping one. Notice your breath. It has been moving all along, slowly, without effort, carrying you through this long history the way a current carries something gently downstream. We traveled tonight through the marshlands of Maryland. Through the pine forests and tidal creeks and flat, wide sky country of the eastern shore. We walked with a woman who learned to read the dark, its sounds, its temperatures, its textures, the way most of us learn to read a room. With our whole bodies. With patient, accumulated attention. We walked with her in September and December and January. In cold rain and frozen mud and the extraordinary silence of a Maryland forest at 3 in the morning. We heard the North Star described not as an astronomical object but as a direction, an intention, a constant. We met the people who helped her, and the people she carried, and the landscape that held all of them in its long memory. Let all of that rest now in the soft dark behind your eyes. Your body is heavy and warm. Your breath is slow and even. The story has done its work. It has given your mind somewhere to travel, somewhere far from the small anxieties of the immediate day, somewhere deep in the past where things happened that were enormous and difficult and, in the end, moving and true. The darkness that Harriet Tubman loved was not the darkness of despair. It was the darkness of possibility. The place where you could move without being seen. The place where the stars were most visible. The place where, if you were patient and quiet and you knew the land, you could find your way to something better. Your darkness tonight is like that. Patient. Quiet. Holding you the way the earth holds everything, without effort, without judgment, simply holding. Let your body sink a little deeper into that holding now. Let your thoughts grow slow and loose and formless, the way the marsh grass moves in a gentle current, not going anywhere in particular, not needing to. The North Star is still overhead. The road is still there for those who need it. But tonight, you don't need to walk it. Tonight, you can simply rest. Rest now. Sleep. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.